Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is the first build guide for Edge of Fate, and it's one I'm excited to share with you because it's probably the most fun Titan build I've made in a long time. As you can see from the background gameplay, this is utilizing the new Titan Exotic Melas Panoplia and the new hammer recall feature, as well as taking advantage of stasis and solar benefits all in one build. We have a lot to go over today, so let's jump right into the subclass. For your super, you can really use any. Hammer of Soul or Burning Maul both work perfectly fine with this build, it just comes down to personal preference. And for abilities, the only one that's mandatory is Throwing Hammer, again to take advantage of the hammer recall feature with the new exotic. As far as your other abilities though, Rally Barricade is my personal preference just to set up for stuff like boss damage with weapons, but again you can use either, there really isn't any restriction behind it. And for your grenade, I would recommend going with a more offensive based grenade. You could use a healing grenade if you wanted pure survivability, and that's totally fine. But with how often you get your grenade back with the setup and how easy it is to take advantage of a bunch of different modifiers to increase our grenade damage and regen, I would recommend going with a more offensive based grenade. In my opinion, Thermite Grenade is the best one for this build, but you can always focus on stuff like the Incendiary Grenade if you want to focus on causing massive ignition chains, or if you want to use something like Fusion Grenade for high damage. On to the aspects, the first one is Soul Invictus. And Soul Invictus basically spawns in a sunspot anytime we kill a scorched enemy, or anytime we get a solar ability final blow. And anytime we walk into the sunspot, not only do we get restoration for constant healing, but we also get improved ability regen across the board. The ability regen isn't too important for stuff like our throwing hammer since it's technically infinite with the setup, but again if you're using an offensive based grenade, that becomes a lot more impactful. In addition, this also improves the duration of your super while you're standing in a sunspot, so having something like Hammer of Soul that can create it on impact becomes really important and can actually lengthen the duration of the super and overall increase its total damage. And sunspots will also scorch nearby enemies, which is a really easy way to have them chain themselves pretty effectively, but again we're mainly using this for the ability boost and the constant restoration. And for the next aspect, we're using Roaring Flames. Now, Roaring Flames did get slightly changed going into Edge of Fate, but the basic premise of it is that as you get solar ability kills, you get a progressively stacking buff up to 3 times, which increases the damage of your solar abilities and your solar super for every stack. For your grenade and your super, at times 3 stacks, you get a 73% damage bonus, and for your melee at times 3, you get a 200% damage bonus. The reason behind this change was that Bungie changed the melee stacking system from multiplicative to additive, so this had its numbers adjusted slightly for melees, but for your grenade and your super, it's unchanged. Onto the fragments, there are a lot of options you can use. Here are the ones that I found work best for this setup and the way I'm particularly using it. Starting off, we have Ember of Empyrean. This will basically make the effects of Restoration and Radiant infinite as long as we keep getting Solar Weapon or Solar Ability final blows, which again this build has no problem doing. The next fragment is Ember of Combustion, just because I'm mainly focusing the stat distribution in this setup around our super, and I'll get into why that is a little bit later. But if you wanted to swap this out and focus on something else, say something like Ember of Resolve for additional cure sources, Ember of Eruption to improve the radius of your ignitions, or something like Ember of Ashes to improve scorch stacking and lead to more ignitions, that's totally fine as well. I just prefer Ember of Combustion with this setup based on the stat distribution I'm going for. Again, I'll break down why that is a little bit later. The next fragment is Ember of Tempering. This will basically give you a bonus to your health stat as you get Solar Weapon final blows. And while you have Ember of Tempering active, Solar Weapon final blows will also create a fire sprite. Now this health bonus, it seems to be about 10 health per stack, and this is for you and your allies up to 3 stacks. So as long as you're getting Solar Weapon final blows, you and nearby allies basically have plus 30 health all the time. And again, as you're getting Solar Weapon final blows, we also create fire sprites. And the final one I'm using is Ember of Char, which allows our ignitions to spread scorch stacks to nearby targets. The main reason behind Ember of Char is its compatibility with something like Ember of Combustion, allowing us to get a ton of ignitions basically for free, and also allowing Soul Invictus to proc constantly by having all these different scorch enemies dying from our solar ability damage and creating a ton of sunspots. Again, this combination is mainly focusing on our super, so if you wanted to swap these two out, I think that's perfectly fine regardless of which setup you're going for, but stuff like Ember of Tempering and Ember of Empyrean I think are kind of mandatory on this setup. Before we get into the armor mods and the new stat system, I do want to talk about the artifact mods I'm using for this build. The first one is Flame, Fiber, and Freeze, mainly because we want to have access to the Solar Stasis Siphon mod with this setup. I'm also using Diviner's Discount to have Scavenger mods have a discounted energy cost. The next mod is Fever and Chill, which offers 2 different effects, and if you want to use a weapon loadout like I am, you can actually take advantage of both of them on this build. Summarized, rapid precision hits with solar weapons give you Radiant, and doing the same with a Stasis weapon grants you Frost Armor. Radiant, of course, is a bonus to your weapon damage, and Frost Armor is increased damage resistance, which really helps out on Solar Titan because we have access to constant healing, but not a lot of damage resist for us intrinsically. So this builds into not only empowering our weapons, but also making us a lot harder to kill. The next mod is Frost Renewal, and this one's a bit situational, but it is something we can take advantage of with Fever and Chill with this loadout, and it allows us a way to freeze enemies and get an additional stack of Frost Armor. The next artifact mod is Elemental Coalescence, and this just basically gives us an increased chance of generating a Fire Sprite as we kill targets. The next mod is Elemental Daze, which will apply an elemental effect when we stun a champion based on the weapon we use. For stasis weapons, it basically instantly freezes and shatters that champion, and for solar weapons, it causes an ignition when we stun a champion. I'm also taking advantage of Cauterized Darkness. This is kind of like Frost Renewal in that we're not going to be taking advantage of it all the time, but it is something we can technically take advantage of. Anytime a non-boss combatant has a stasis debuff on them, mainly stuff like slowed or they're frozen, you basically deal 30% more solar damage to them. Again, it's only for non-bosses, but it is something we can take advantage of periodically, so we might as well do so. And then for the last column, I only have one artifact mod currently unlocked, but I will recommend two that I would use for this build. The first one is Radiant Shrapnel. Anytime that you're dealing sustained weapon damage while you're radiant or after you defeat a scorched target, it'll cause a solar projectile to shoot out and scorch targets on impact. This is just another way to build into scorch stacking very effectively and possibly proc ignitions just off of getting kills or dealing damage. The one thing to focus on with Radiant Shrapnel is that it doesn't require you to use a specific weapon with this setup, it just requires you to be radiant or have a scorched combatant be defeated. Meaning that if we're using a stasis weapon to get stuff like Frost Armor, we can also use Radiant Shrapnel to have it upkeep our solar verbs like Restoration, Radiant, Scorching, and Igniting. For the final artifact mod, there are two recommendations I have. The first one is Shield Crush, which will give you an increase to your grenade and melee regen and grenade and melee damage based on the elemental verbs that you have. And the final mod I would recommend is Frigid Glare, which whenever you have Frost Armor active, causes a freezing burst when you get a precision final blow with a stasis weapon. Again, this fits very nicely with stuff like Fever and Chill, as well as stuff like Radiant Shrapnel, allowing us to chain these scorching effects while also proccing freezing effects, and again building into Frost Armor, while also upkeeping Radiant and Restoration. Onto the armor mods for the build. The first one I'm using is Super Font, and this is basically an updated version of the previous font mods in the old system. In this new system, Armor Charge works pretty much the exact same, just the effects the mods provides are slightly different. Super Font gives us plus 20 stats to our super stat while we have a stack of Armor Charge. Besides that, I'm also using a Thermodynamic Siphon mod, basically giving us Solar and Stasis Siphon all in one. And the final mod is Hands On, just to give us a bit more super energy on melee kill, since I'm focusing on super with our stat distribution. Onto our gauntlets, and our exotic for today is Melas Panoplia, and this is the new Titan Exotic. Basically, this gives your throwing hammer a recall feature. It's a bit complicated in how it works, so let me give you a very basic explanation of it. As you get rapid solar final blows or you collect a fire sprite, you'll get a perk called Forge Master, which activates when you throw your throwing hammer. When you throw your throwing hammer and hit a target, after a small delay, it'll create an audio cue and start to glow. This is basically your trigger to activate a perfect recall, which will basically give you a benefit for recalling your hammer. But with that said, you can activate it at any time, whether it's instantly after it hit a target or a little bit after it landed. You can recall it whenever. The perfect recall just gives you a bonus for doing it at that time. When you perform a perfect recall, not only will it upkeep the duration of the Forge Master buff, but it also provides a small solar explosion at the hammer's location. So you kind of get to double dip into your hammer throw a bit with it. And again, as you perform perfect recalls or as you collect fire sprites, you upkeep the Forge Master buff duration. It is possible to upkeep Forge Master indefinitely, but you basically always need to be getting kills with the setup to do so. So it's very normal to have this active for about 10 to 20 seconds and then have to reproc it by getting a few weapon kills or picking up a fire sprite. But again, with the proper setup, it's very easy to do that. As far as the mods on the gauntlets, I'm going with 2 stacks of heavy-handed just to give us a 5-second cooldown between generating an orb of power with our throwing hammer. I'm also using a grenade font mod just to give us plus 20 grenade stat anytime we have a stack of armor charge. If you wanted to, this could also be swapped out for something like a 3rd stack of heavy-handed just to increase the orb gen with this setup. I just personally find that having 2 is more than enough. Onto the chest piece, the first mod I'm going with is a stack of health font, again just to improve our health stat. I'll go into why that is a little bit later. This basically raises the ceiling on our maximum time that we can have these effects active by adding in another stack of armor charge. And the final mod I'm using is a resistance based mod for the activity that I'm in. Solar Titan has constant healing, which is a great effect for survivability, but it doesn't have any access for damage resistance, which is also just as important. So having a resistance mod based on the enemies I'm fighting is a good way to improve our survivability, especially when stacked on top of stuff like frost armor. For our legs, I'm using 2 stacks of a solar weapon surge just to improve our solar weapon's damage by 16% anytime we have a stack of armor charge. And again, that same stack of armor charge also gives us a lot of stat bonuses based on our mod loadout. And the final mod I'm using is a solar scavenger mod to give us more ammo on ammo brick pickup. For the mark, I'm using 2 stacks of time dilation to extend the duration of our armor decay effects. With 2 stacks, the duration of our armor decay, which is our surges and our font mods, goes from 10 seconds to 18 seconds. Again, when combined with Charged Up, this dramatically increases the total time we can actually have these effects active without needing to pick up an overpower. And the final mod is Powerful Attraction. Again, using your class ability isn't too relevant with this setup, but it is a very easy way to instantly pick up any nearby orbs of power. These orbs of power will not only heal us because of the health stat change, but also activate all of our decay effects like our surges and our stat bonuses, so it's a very easy way to pick up a bunch of orbs that are nearby. Very quickly, I want to talk about the new armor system and stat system in Destiny 2, just because it might be a bit confusing to players who were kind of out of the loop for a while. Basically, in Edge of Fate, stats were overhauled and a new armor system was dropped. If you have old armor, it's basically converted 1-to-1 to the new system, meaning if you had double 100s or triple 100 stat spreads, you still have that in this new system. It's just your armor doesn't have the new bonuses that newer armor drops might have. In addition, stats across the board are basically entirely different. The new stat Health will give you health pickup every time you pick up an orb of power, and this increases the more you invest in your health. Past 100, you get into the bonus territory, where from 100 to 200, your shields will recharge more quickly and you have additional health when facing combatants, meaning that the shield portion of your health is just a lot better and recovers a lot faster. And again, this effect improves as you go from 100 to 200. Melee kind of works the same way it did before, where having a higher melee investment reduces your melee cooldown, but also now as you have a higher melee stat total, you also get more melee energy back from all sources. So if, for example, if you're using something like Pugilist, you now get more melee energy back from that as you have a higher stat investment. Beyond 100, you get an increase to your melee damage, which maxes out at 30% increased melee damage at 200 stacks. For your grenade, it works the exact same as melee, but at 200, you get a 65% damage bonus to your grenade, which is pretty massive. Super kind of works like grenade and melee, where it increases the super energy you get from all of your different sources. So if you're going for a super focused setup, or you want to take advantage of your super in some way, I would recommend investing in your super quite a bit. At 100 stats, you get a 190% boost to all of your super regen sources, which means if you use something like hands-on, for example, this is almost giving you 3 times the super energy per melee kill that it normally would. Beyond 100 to 200, it'll give you an escalating damage bonus to your super in PvE, and again, having something like Soul Invictus, which can increase the duration of your super in general, makes this very, very strong. Class kind of works the same as melee and grenade, where it provides a regen bonus and a flat cooldown up to 100. From 100 to 200, it gives you an overshield when you use your class ability. And weapons is a new stat, where from 0 to 100, you get an increase to your reload and handling, as well as damage against minor and major enemies. Past 100 to 200, you basically get intrinsic scavenger built into your build, and you also deal more damage to bosses. Now that that's out of the way, what stats would I actually recommend for this setup? The first one I would recommend is having 70 melee baseline. The reason for this is because of the stat changes, having less than 70 melee means that if you use your throwing hammer normally and then pick it up again, you won't actually get the full regen of your throwing hammer. As you can see at 70 stats, I'm only at 104% melee energy, which means if we went a little bit lower, say 68 or 67, we would be at sub 100%, meaning that if we picked up our throwing hammer normally, we wouldn't get our full energy back. So because of this, we want to have a mandatory 70 stats in melee, just to make sure that if we ever use our throwing hammer normally, we get it back when we pick it up instantly. I do want to point out though that Melas Panoplia actually overrides the stat requirement for this, and anytime that you recall your hammer, regardless of your stat, you will always get your melee back in full. But again, if we ever needed to throw it normally, or if we don't have Forge Master active, it's important that we get our full melee back like we normally would in the previous system. Beyond that, I'm personally investing in super just because of the duration bonus Soul Invictus gives us, and also because of how fast we can actually get our super with this setup. This gets even better when you remember that Roaring Flames is giving us a 73% damage increase to our super, and so having that bonus coming from our super stat, and then taking advantage of stuff like Ember of Combustion and Ember of Char becomes very powerful. Again, this is just the way that I'm personally investing this build. You don't have to fully invest in super if you don't want to. I've just found that it's a very fun playstyle and very powerful when done right. Again, if you don't want to invest in super for your setup, you don't have to. You can invest fully into your melee if you want to maximize the damage that your hammer actually does, or if you want to go with the typical brawler playstyle, you can also invest heavily into your health, allowing you to have much better survivability in PvE. I just personally enjoy this build when heavily invested into super alongside these other stats. And the final thing to keep in mind is that I'm using a health font, a grenade font, a super font, and we have Ember of Tempering intrinsically on our subclass. Ember of Tempering will give us plus 30 health for us and nearby allies when at ×3 stacks, and when combined with our health font mod, this means that we basically get plus 50 health, which dramatically increases the health per orb pickup, and also gives us a small bonus to our shield recharge rate and our shield health. Finally, onto the weapons I'd recommend using for the build. There's a wide variety of weapons that pair really nicely with this setup, and so it's really customizable depending on the content you're in or if you have any personal preferences around certain weapons.
My go-to weapon with this build is Lord of Wolves, because for those that don't know, Lord of Wolves is still one of the best weapons in the entire game. It has some of the best sustained DPS, it scorches for us, which is fantastic with this build, and can also take advantage of the artifact perks. All in all, it's a fantastic weapon, and I cannot recommend it enough, especially with this build. Besides Lord of Wolves, which is mainly here for a boss-focused weapon, I would recommend something like Devil's Ruin for more generalized content. Devil's Ruin actually got a slight rework going into Edge of Fate. Summed up, Final Blows will now periodically generate a fire sprite, and after you pick up that fire sprite, you can then enable the beam mode of this weapon to deal a ton of damage and force an ignition. Now the damage that this beam does along with the ignition damage is actually really impressive for a primary weapon, so I would use this as more of a Nightfall type weapon, and then if you're running a dungeon or a raid, potentially Lord of Wolves would be a better fit. Besides Devil's Ruin and Lord of Wolves, pretty much any weapon that can scorch in some way is fantastic. Stuff like Tommy's Matchbook and Prometheus Lens are also good alternatives if you like any of those, but again, as long as it's a solar weapon that in some way can scorch, you're pretty much set. For your heavy weapon, the only exotic I would really recommend is Dragon's Breath, and that's mainly because this also benefits from picking up fire sprites periodically, and it can scorch a lot of enemies in a very large area. For my other weapons, I'm using an LMG mainly with Incandescent. There's nothing special about this one. Again, it's just a way for me to scorch targets additionally. If you want to focus on using a rocket, you could use Hezen Vengeance or Apex Predator for a more boss DPS focused weapon if you needed it. And for your primary weapon, this is where you kind of have a few different areas you can use. Again, I'm using a Stasis weapon to proc Frost Armor to help with the survivability of this build, while also chaining back into the restoration and radiant effects that this build specializes in. If you'd rather go with just a pure kinetic weapon, that's totally fine. Again, there's really no restrictions behind this build because of how customizable it is, so if you have a specific weapon you want to use, you can totally do so. The other one I do want to point out is any 1-2 punch shotgun would work really nicely with this build, because in addition to some of the melee additive changes with the new system, Throwing Hammer now works with 1-2 punch again. So if you wanted to have an easy way to increase your melee damage without speccing fully into your melee stat, you could use a 1-2 punch shotgun and use it with Throwing Hammer to dramatically increase its damage. Again, it's not necessarily the direction I would go with this build, because at that point you might as well just put on Syntheseps or Worm God and just make it a full melee build, but if you wanted to do that and still have the benefits of this setup, you can totally do that too. All in all guys, that's the build for today. Like I said at the start of the video, this has quickly become one of my favorite builds currently in Destiny, mainly just because of the hammer recall feature, along with a fantastic pairing of stasis and solar abilities. Dim link is down in the description below if you want to try the build out for yourself, and let me know in the comments what you think. As always, thank you guys so much for watching the video. I greatly appreciate your continued support, and as always, have a good day.